Alright, so this may seem kind of out of left field for my channel, but I am not the biggest fan of Godzilla, but still a fan of Godzilla and the Godzilla franchise. Like, obviously based on some of the stuff you can see in the background there, I like giant monster fights. That is a thing that interests me, and so of course, eventually my attention would be drawn to these movies. And so, like a lot of Godzilla fans, I was really excited for the 2014 Hollywood version of Godzilla. We had already gotten one, and I liked it as a kid before I knew better, but now rewatching it,
that's a lot of fish.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. But seeing trailers for this 2014 version, it definitely looked like they were gonna get it right this time. And so I was really psyched going into this. And while I've never really talked about it on this channel, I feel like I should talk about it now, since we're finally getting the first proper sequel to this movie at the end of this month. Godzilla, King of the Monsters. And if it ends up being as good as it looks, I'm definitely going to want to gush about it. And if it's not as good as it looks, I'm going to want to bitch about it. So either way, I'm going to want to talk about it here on the channel. And I felt like I should talk about the first one first. There's also another sort of sequel to this movie. That's Kong Skull Island. But really, that's a sequel in the way that Thor is a sequel to Iron Man. That said, I'm not going to go beat for beat through the plot of this movie. This is just more to convey to you guys my opinion on it, so that you'll know where I'm coming from when I talk about King of the Monsters. Probably next week, maybe the week after, I'm not really sure yet. That said, right out the gate, I actually like this movie a lot. I don't think it's perfect or anything, and I definitely share some of the common complaints with others who I have seen critiquing this film, but I think it's a good movie, and I think as a jumping off point for a Hollywood Godzilla cinematic universe, it works pretty well. And now I do say that, again, fully admitting that I'm not a huge fan of Godzilla. Anyway, I'm not like in the Godzilla fandom or anything. So I was never going to be some kind of Toho Godzilla loyalist who believes that only the Toho Godzilla movies are true Godzilla movies. I was always going to give this one a chance. And this isn't me saying that if you are only a fan of those Toho Godzilla movies that you're doing something wrong. You do you. I'm just trying to explain why maybe I might be a little more lenient on this movie than others would. Like, I do love the Toho Godzilla movies, the ones that I've seen anyway. I've still not seen like maybe 3 or 4 of them. I in particular really love Mothra vs. Godzilla and Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. They're probably my favorite of the whole bunch. And I'm also a dude who loves practical effects, so getting to see practical effects used to bring monsters to life and have them fight each other, that's really cool to me. But I've always wanted to see a more big budget take on a kaiju fight, one which, in terms of the way the monsters move and behave, might be a little more, I won't say realistic, because there's nothing realistic about kaiju in the first place, but I don't know. I guess realistic is the best word. Realistic to how it would be if the square cube wall didn't exist and kaiju could be a thing. And I do think they nail that really hard in this movie. Let's talk first about some of the things that I don't like about it so I can end this on a positive note, because at the end of the day, this is a pretty optimistic movie, and I feel like if this is going to be a positive review overall, it should end on an optimistic note too. That said, I feel like the first half of this movie is maybe only average at best. It starts out really strong, setting things up super well. You actually have Bryan Cranston in this movie. He's only in the first act of the movie. We'll get to that in a minute. And his character is actually at the center of setting up events. He's a nuclear technician at a nuclear plant in Japan. His wife works at the plant with him, and he actually loses her in a reactor breach caused by one of the villain monsters of this movie, the Mutos, first appearing, causing a bunch of earthquakes with its mere presence. And despite the fact that he actually gets to talk to his wife a little bit before she dies, and she insists that he look after their son, Ford, he doesn't really. He instead obsesses over finding the thing which destroyed that plant and killed her, and doing something about it. So when this thing actually becomes a problem again, later, he actually ends up having information that even the scientists studying the Muto don't have. Like, there's another scene before this one where Ken Watanabe's character, Dr. Sarazawa, actually walks with some other researchers, people who end up working on the Muto project later. They walk through this cavern with these giant kaiju bones, like fossilized kaiju bones, sticking up out of the ground. It's a very atmospheric scene. But whenever I think about the beginning of this movie, it's that scene with Bryan Cranston that really sticks with me. It sets the tone for the movie, I think. Because this is a Godzilla movie. It does follow mostly the Godzilla formula. There is a human element at play in the movie. Humans who are trying their best to deal with this problem. But oh no, they can't, and then so Godzilla has to come in and clean up their mess. And it's definitely Bryan Cranston's family, which eventually becomes Ford's family when we jump 15 years in the future and he now has a wife and a family. It's their side of things that really sticks with me. The military stuff, the scientist stuff, it doesn't really stick with me all that much, except for Ken Watanabe's character. He's really cool and he gets a really fantastic moment in this movie. Like, there's three really fantastic moments of this movie which come out of the human element. And the first is definitely Bryan Cranston having to seal the hatchway behind which his wife is trapped to prevent radiation from getting out and killing everyone in the plant, as well as probably everyone else in the city in which it's situated. And then we get a shot of the two of them talking to each other through the porthole in this hatch, and it's just so emotionally raw and a fantastic scene. The second is later on when the military realizes that there's not really anything they could do to stand up to the Mutos, and so Dr. Sarazawa says, "Let them fight," which was of course in all the promotional material for the movie, so that probably doesn't come as a surprise to anyone who has seen the trailer for this. But it's still a really cool, really memorable moment in the film. And then a third one that I'll talk about in a minute. But that's really it. Like, I like most of the human characters in this. There's no, like, dickish military guy or evil scientist guy or anything in this movie. All of the human characters do come across as intelligent, well-meaning, good guy characters who are trying their best to do what's right as much as they can. It's just, I didn't really find their side of things all that memorable, and it's probably because a big chunk of the first half of this movie is just exposition. It's just world building for this version of the Godzilla universe, which doesn't even really come into play all that much. Like, they treat the Mutos like they're some sort of parasitic spore in animal form or something, which doesn't really make sense in and of itself, really, especially considering what they actually look like. They're sort of buggy and batty at the same time. And they also hypothesize kind of that Godzilla is this thing which fixes nature, sets things back on the status quo. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but the implication is that this is something that he is compelled to do, that he has to do. It's his role in nature, and that he rises up to fight the Mutos because they intend to breed, which will upset the status quo of nature as it currently stands. And that does imply that if we screw up things too much, he will eventually emerge as our enemy. But that doesn't come into play in this movie at all, so I don't even know why it's there. And so the stuff in the first half of the movie does drag quite a bit, but then the Mutos start doing more stuff. And they are a cool-looking monster, even if they are kind of generic sci-fi monster in terms of their design. And then Godzilla starts showing up, and yeah, some people have critiqued this movie for teasing Godzilla. We see his spines coming out of the water in some old footage. We see his legs and his tail, but we don't really see him until like the third act. And even then, when we do see him, it's when he first engages one of the Mutos, and then they cut away and don't cut back to the fight until some of the fight has already happened. But once the fight actually gets going, it's magnificent. The entire third act of this movie is a continuous action sequence, and while there's definitely some directing choices which could have been made that I think would have made it better, it was still really good. It's a little dark. It's sometimes a little hard to see what's happening, but it's still really good. And what really surprised me about this movie, especially going back to rewatch it with fresh eyes for this review, looking at it a little more critically than I did the first time through, was just how much character stuff they managed to inject into that last act for Ford and Godzilla, who end up becoming parallel characters by the end, as interesting as that sounds. Ford is here because he's in the military at this point, the implication being that he entered the military to run away from his father, to get away from his father, who was super obsessed with this Muto thing. They do get a chance to reconnect, though, before the movie is over. It makes for a really touching scene. Right before Bryan Cranston's character dies, though, which I think was a stupid mistake. I definitely think they should have tried to keep him alive, because his character was objectively the best thing about the first act of this movie. But anyway, he entered the military seemingly to run away from his father because he didn't feel like his father cared about him. He felt that his father only really cared about this obsession over this thing that, as far as Ford was concerned, didn't even exist. But he is one of the few people who can help these military guys to enact a plan to draw the monsters away from San Francisco, where they're having their big final fight, and hopefully save a lot of people. But if they fail to do this, a nuclear device will go off in the city and kill all of the survivors. So Ford goes in with this detachment of military guys. He's the one who would disarm the nuclear device if it were possible to disarm it. It doesn't end up being possible to disarm it. But he goes in with all these military guys, and we get this really great scene where they find the nuclear device in the Muto nest. They're using the radiation from the device to feed their eggs. And meanwhile, while this is going on, Godzilla has been blindsided by one of the two creatures, because there's two Mutos, a larger, bulkier female who can't use her wings because she's too large, and a smaller, more nimble male who can, and he has blindsided Godzilla from the sky while he was distracted fighting the female, and now Godzilla is at real risk of dying. And Ford, recognizing the threat of this Muto nest, he stays behind and destroys it, at great risk to himself, even further injuring himself in the process, and inadvertently creates a distraction for Godzilla, drawing the attention of the Mutos away long enough for one of the coolest scenes in the movie to happen. Like, seriously, say what you want about this movie, Godzilla's nuclear fire has never looked so good. And, like, already, this version of Godzilla, the way they animate him, the way he moves, the way he carries himself, his facial features and expression, there's a lot of personality that comes through in all of that. More so than you can convey with even a heavily animatronic rubber suit. More so than I think Toho is concerned with conveying through their version of Godzilla in general, which, yes, that is a criticism of the Toho films, don't at me. Godzilla feels like a character in and of himself already, but then we get this great moment between him and Ford. It's during this whole sequence where Ford has destroyed this nest. He's trying to get back to the other guys from his little group so that he can help them to carry the nuclear device offshore where it can detonate without hurting anybody. And Godzilla gets knocked down. He's just defeated one of the two Mutos, and he gets knocked down by a falling building. And the two of them lock eyes, and this understanding passes between them. They are both hurt and tired, and they just want to rest. They don't want to be doing this anymore. But Ford, he keeps going because he's that heroic a guy, that self-sacrificing a guy. He recognizes that if he can do something about this, he should. That no matter how much he doesn't want to have to be doing this, he's just going to keep right on fighting. And we do see a couple minutes later that Godzilla apparently had the same thought, because he gets up and rallies against the second Muto and defeats it as well. Like, this is that third memorable scene that I mentioned earlier, and it's probably the best scene in the entire movie, even better than. The ending of their stories is even a parallel. We think for a while that Godzilla might have died from his injuries fighting the Mutos, but he eventually is able to get up and keep going. Meanwhile, Ford was very clearly willing to sacrifice himself to get the nuclear device out to sea, and he doesn't end up having to. People end up coming in and rescuing him, but he was willing to sacrifice himself, just like it seems that Godzilla was willing to sacrifice himself for the greater good and the survival of as many people as possible. Like, I bitched a little bit about how they tease us with Godzilla before showing him off, but I do really like where they chose to finally reveal Godzilla's entire body, and that's when some missiles fired by the military sort of go off course and they're going to hit civilians on the Golden Gate Bridge, and Godzilla rises up out of the water to shield them from the blast, framing him as a truly heroic version of this character. And not only that, but they do keep an aspect of Godzilla's character that I really, really love, that he's actually incredibly intelligent and strategic. He's tough enough physically that he can withstand hits from monsters who are comparably powerful, and then should his own offensive power not be enough to handle those monsters directly, he tends to learn from the way that they fight and come back later and use that knowledge to defeat them. And he does that against the Mutos here. And, like, end of the day, mixed bag or not, and I will say that this movie is a mixed bag. It rounds out to be pretty damn good, but never actually reaches the heights of greatness. But mixed bag or not, as a jumping off point for the cinematic universe, as I said before, I think this works pretty well. And even if King of the Monsters turns out to be absolute crap, at the very least, the existence of this movie gave us that final trailer for King of the Monsters, which is just an absolute masterpiece.
Run.
And as I alluded to before, Kong Skull Island is also a pretty good movie. I'm glad to have gotten the chance to watch that too, and I wouldn't have gotten to if this movie didn't exist. Like, I do definitely think that there are things that they could do better in this movie. And it does seem like they're going to be taking that to heart for the sequel. But this is still a fun movie. If you're a Godzilla fan, you haven't seen it, you should. I don't see why you wouldn't. But as per usual, guys, I'd like to know, what do you think of Godzilla 2014 if you have seen it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over in my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.